Welcome back to Drafting the Past. This is a podcast about the craft of writing history, and I'm your host, Kate Carpenter. Before I get started with today's episode, a quick favor to ask. If you're a fan of the show, will you leave a review on your favorite podcast app? It helps people to know that this is a show worth checking out, and it really does help. Okay, so when I asked listeners for feedback a few months ago, a couple of you mentioned that you'd love to hear from writers in other academic fields who also work on historical topics. If that was you, then today's episode is especially for you. Dr. Anna Law is a political scientist, but for her new book, Migration and the Origins of American Citizenship, she retrained herself in historical methods to write the book she really hoped to write. I'm happy to have Anna on the show today.
I'm so excited to be here.
Dr. Anna Law is a professor of political science and the Herbert Kurz Chair in Constitutional Rights at CUNY Brooklyn College. In her new book, she takes a close look at which parts of the U.S. government have controlled people's ability to move around and across borders throughout the country's history. It's a history that's especially pertinent now as we await the Supreme Court's forthcoming decision about the Trump administration's attempt to end the right to birthright citizenship protected under the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. Anna and I talked about what it meant to think like a historian as well as a political scientist. She also divulged her decidedly analog research tools, the feedback she asked colleagues to give on her drafts, and her advice for any writer deciding on a press for publishing a book. Enjoy my conversation with Dr. Anna Law.
So I began as writing political science research, and I am still a political scientist, but mid-career I decided, I'm going to write more like a historian. And I made the decision early on in this second book to write for a general audience, which it's Marcus Rediker said you need to want to do that and you need to commit to it and read widely and read people who do that properly. So I started as an academic political scientist writer, and I became a legal and policy history writer mid-career, and with the aim of writing for a broader audience. And part of that grew out of frustration of my own field, where it's just infested with jargon. I mean, not everyone, but a lot of it.
Let's just talk about the basics. When and where do you like to do your writing?
I keep the hours of an old lady. I go to sleep really early. And when I was closing out this book project, which took forever, I set my alarm for 5 a.m. because I like to write early in the morning. No one is pinging me. It seems like I just have the world to myself and it's peaceful. So I did that for a year and a half to finish the book. But now that the book is done and I've turned the alarm off, I still wake up between 4 and 5:30. So I just start writing then.
Not a bad habit. How do you like to organize yourself?
You mean every morning or
Either, yeah.
Look, the first essential thing is make the coffee so my brain is actually somewhat on. And by the end of the second cup of coffee, I feel like I'm at my peak awakeness. What I usually do is write for a couple of hours and then put a sticky note on my computer saying, okay, this is where I left off. And now next session, I need to cover the history of this thing. But if I do that every day, it's easy. But if I'm away for a few days, that's where the sticky note is useful.
Do you try to write every day?
I try to write every day. It doesn't always happen. Some days it's not a matter of no time. I mean, yes, the days that I teach, it's more hectic. But there are days where I'm not running off to teach or, other administrative duties, and the brain it's not happening. It's not happening. I have long accepted, okay, you know what? I'm not fully in control of my brain. There are days where it's going to flow, and there are days it's not happening. If I can't write, I will go and read something that's related to the project.
How do you keep track of all your research and your reading notes?
I am old school, so I know, scholars, my friends who's like, "Oh, you gotta use Scrivener," and okay, I have a pile of physical notebooks where if I read something, I take notes and I write notes to myself. So it's like a writer's diary where I'm talking to myself. It's a ongoing dialogue with myself. Here's two things that I don't know what's the relationship to each other. Figure it out. Those are the kind of notes that I take.
How do you then do you just read your notes back to yourself all the times, or how do you translate notes to writing?
I go through the notes, and so for example, I read many books and I took notes while I was reading. I will then go through the notebooks again before I write and use a highlighter and highlight, okay, I need to cite this, or I need to make sure I mention this part of the book. And then that's how it goes from me. That's how I process the information, that I highlight the yellow. I need to mention this in the text of what I'm writing.
Do you like to outline then to sort of keep track of where you're going?
I try to outline. My dissertation advisor told me once, he said, "Oh, that's nice." I said, "What do you mean that's nice?" He said, "Oh, I don't outline. I just put words on a page and keep fiddling it with it until it's right." And I can't do that. That sounds insane. So I do have a rough outline. I don't always follow it, but there's got to be on paper the skeleton of what am I doing? Of course, I might change it, but the way he writes just terrifies me.
If I don't have at least a bare bones outline, I could go off on so many rabbit holes. It's
Right? I'm going on tangents and way veering way off. So he's like, "Yeah, I just keep rewriting it until I know it's okay." And yeah, everyone has their own process. I can't do that.
what does the revision process look like for you?
So one of the things that I adopted and learned mid-career and implemented for this second book is use one writing session to write. And what I tell my students, I describe it and they laugh. I said, I vomit write in a session. I'm spewing words onto the page. I'm not stopping to edit. And I I don't care if there are topic sentences or if I repeat things. I'm just spewing words onto a page. And in a different writing session, I will only edit. In one session, I'll write, and then another session, I'll edit. And I told my students, I said, you guys keep thinking that, oh, I can't start writing until I figure out what I'm going to write. That's not how it is. You figure out what you're going to say in the process of writing. I said, and don't you feel better when you're feeling sick and you after you vomit? And they're like, "What?" I said, "When you get words on the page, even if they're messy, then that's when I can help you. If there's nothing on the page, I cannot help you shape nothingness of the page. Put words down, doesn't have to be pretty. You can make it pretty later."
What does the making it pretty look like? Are you printing it out and writing on it? How do you approach that?
Sometimes I edit on the computer, but most times, if it's more than 8 pages, I have to print it out and mark it up with pen and pencil. And I oftentimes, when I'm vomit writing, topic sentences go missing, and I have to move paragraphs around to make sure the flow and the order. So that's what's going on with pen and paper.
I want to bug you for some really nitty gritty process details because I have learned that listeners are nerds like I am and love it when they hear like specifically what supplies people are using. And I know that you use some specific supplies for marking up your books and keeping track of reading. Can you tell me more about what you use?
I have no tips for these high-tech resources because I'm literally old school, and there are these things called they're metal darts that I stick in the books as I'm reading because those are the passages I want to cite later, right? Especially if it's a library book, I can't be marking the book. I mean, I could, but I'd be an asshole. And like I know enough librarians that they say thank you for using those because you know those the plastic flags that we all have that are much cheaper. The librarians hate that because when you take it out, if you're not careful, you're going to rip the page, right? So out of respect for the library books and even for my own books, and I don't want like a million flags sticking out of it, the page points, the darts, after I use them, I can reuse them. So I use those to mark, okay, I have to cite this passage or I have to cover this concept. And that's the unsexy tools that I use.
I don't know. I think metal page darts are pretty sexy.
I think so, but people are like, no, you have, all these other tools like Scrivener, which I'm sure is to me, whatever gets it done. Whatever gets you to the end of the book, however you organize it, get it done. It does. There's not one way to. I choose to do it the old fashioned way.
Absolutely. Do you have favorite notebooks?
I have these notebooks called some sort of French notebook where the ink doesn't bleed to the next page if I write in them. So I have a pile of those, but I have a notebook problem. I keep buying blank notebooks because I like the promise of them, and now I need a 12-step program to wean me off of it.
A relatable problem, I think, to have. Do you have favorite pens too?
This gel pen, the Zarasa from a Japanese pen. So I have a bunch of those. I bought them at Jet Pens, which is a dangerous place.
Oh,
It's a
so
Japanese
dangerous.
stationery store. Be careful. Don't say I didn't warn you.
Awesome. I want to talk a little bit more. You as you mentioned, you're a political scientist, but to write this book, you felt like you needed to sort of change tact a little bit and become interdisciplinary and train yourself in historical work. And I understand from following you on social media that it was really important to you to sort of do that right. What did that process of retraining yourself in that way look like?
The retraining involved tons and tons and tons of reading of historians' monograph. So I understood what was happening in each time period. Since I have no formal training in US history, I wasn't comfortable writing anything until I felt like I had a sense of what was happening in each time period. So my friend Rachel Sheldon said, for us, the past is a foreign country. It really was. So for an example, the colonial chapter, oh my God, people, please read my colonial chapter because it took 3 years. One chapter took 3 years. Why did it take 3 years? Because I did 2 years of reading just to understand basic information before I was willing to put pen to paper. So retraining myself as a historian meant I have to read a ton to lay down basic information, whereas a colonial historian would have probably blown through that chapter in a couple of months, not 3 years.
Did you feel like historians think differently than political scientists do?
I don't think they think differently, but I did need to be aware of the conventions of the field because there are political scientists who are American political development specialists like me who study history, but our focuses are different. So we use historical evidence the same way, but I felt like I needed to understand, okay, what are the conventions of writing history from historians and from legal historians? And what are the conventions for political scientists? What I did know from the very start was there are no different standards for historical accuracy. No one is going to say, "Oh, she doesn't have a PhD in US history. She can be a little bit wrong." That's not happening. So, reading a ton and understanding the conventions of different disciplines.
How would you say that political scientists approach historical evidence differently?
They focus on so historians write about political figures, they write about federalism like I do. They write about the Supreme Court and the federal courts. The difference I see within our between our two fields is that political scientists focus more on power and they focus especially on institutions like the Supreme Court, for example, as how does that institution as comprised of not just bricks and mortars, buildings and people, how is that institution or an institution like federalism, how does it structure and channel political power? So we study the same topics, but we focus on different things. So the analogy I would give is, so I live in New York City. And if you go to Times Square, it's an insane like sensory overload of, there's people, there's jugglers, there's naked cowboys, there's all sorts of things going on. A historian and a political scientist can go to Times Square and you might aim your camera in one direction and capture one thing, and I'll aim my camera in a different direction and capture something else. It's still Times Square. It's what we chose to zero in and focus on.
That makes sense. I'm interested in, you've described migration and the origins of American citizenship as a synthesis, meaning that, you really drew from a lot of other scholarship, but used that to make new insights and bring that together. What were your strategies for sort of balancing what other people had said with your analysis and your conclusions and making that all a coherent piece of writing?
I think that was one of the big challenges of the project. I would say 60% of the time of the 16 years I spent was reading historians, reading law review articles, federal Indian law to educate myself on what is happening in these time periods. Once I read all those things and I had explained to myself what was happening, I then had to explain to readers, right? So after I read all the secondary sources, and in one chapter, I used primary sources, multiple chapters, I read federal and state laws in that synthesis. I had to figure out what's the narrative, what's the overarching narrative. And then once I figured out what I was going to say, then I plugged in the historical monographs and the law review articles and the laws that I read into my narrative. But it took a long time to figure out what my overall narrative would be.
Talk me through how you thought about structuring the book then.
The structure, so the narrative arc, the time period where it began and where it ended, that was the easy part. Because there's a clear demarcation from the colonial period to 1888, where the colonies and then the states control international and interstate migration. So I have the beginning and end point. That's the easy part. But the in the middle part is, I thought, okay, so of this phenomenon where we have local control of international and internal migration, what elements of it do people need to know to understand how this was happening, why it was happening, who was subject to these laws? So then once I figured out the time period, I used each chapter to spotlight an element of local control over migration.
Did you have an ideal reader in mind while you were writing? How did you think about the audience?
So I lied to my commissioning editor. He said, he said, who's your primary audience? I said, oh, those would be political science scholars who are American political development specialists like me. Okay, that's all of 10 people. Yeah, so early on in the project, I decided my ideal reader is a smart layperson like my undergrad students. I tried to thread the needle of saying something new and interesting to scholars who are specialists in this area, but to not lose general readers who are smart laypersons, like a New York Times reader, like a NPR listener, like a college student, like the ones sitting in my classroom.
Mm-hmm. Did it take work for you to achieve a voice to reach that reader? Did you have to revise for that, or did it come naturally?
I don't know if it came naturally, but I knew to strip out jargon. Jargon always bothered me. But so I made a concerted effort to not use jargon. And as I had friends read chapters, I would tell them, If you see a sentence and you have to read it 3 times and you still don't know what I'm talking about, you should flag it because that means I wasn't clear. So I don't know if it came naturally, but I tried to write accessibly.
What kinds of people did you turn to for feedback?
So because I covered so many time periods I am not familiar with, I thankfully had historian friends who are specialists in those periods. So for each chapter, the colonial chapter, I had a colonial historian friend read it and other people who specialize in that area. But when it came to the perspectives, I had grad school friends who are not in my subfield at all because I need to be clear. And the introduction and the prospectus, what if I'm not clear, people stop reading, including the commissioning editor. So it depended on what I was shopping around. I had different people read it.
I'm curious about you. You also have written quite a few op-eds and opinion essays, which are also very much pitched at a wider readership and very engaging voice. Is the process of writing those different than the way you approach writing a book?
It is. And because it comes in the stage after the book is out, that's when you're the most tired. When that book went out the door and I turned in the last round of revisions of, correcting page proofs, my instinct is I never want to see this thing again after 16 years. Sweet Jesus, please don't come back. It's like, it was like I was a happy empty nester kicking the last kid out saying, please don't come back. I wish you well. Please do not come back. But you have to promote your book, and I had to write op-eds. So the op-eds are much shorter, they are written for a general audience, and I would characterize them as like an appetizer. It's to make people interested enough that maybe they'll read the book, that maybe they'll buy the book and borrow the book and read more.
That brings me to another question because I know that you've mentioned that you don't have a publicist or really a publicity team, which is supporting this book. And I think sometimes that surprises people, but it's quite common for authors, of course. How have you approached trying to get the word out about your book?
In theory, your press is supposed to have a publicity office. In actual practice, academic presses, their offices are understaffed and overwhelmed with the number of books they have to promote. And no author, even the ones with like a five-figure publicist, ever feel like their book is getting enough attention. You have to do it yourself. I'm only on one social media platform, which is Blue Sky. And so I've been relentlessly posting stuff on that about the book. And you got to roll up your sleeves and hustle. Megan Kate Nelson told me this. She said, I don't care if you have a publicist, you still have to pitch podcasts, you have to write op-eds. You cannot just publish a book and say, well, people will just recognize my brilliance and they will read it. They may not even know about it. How are they supposed to know about it? You have to put it in front of them.
You've mentioned elsewhere the challenges of writing a second book. This was your second book. Can you talk a little bit for people who maybe haven't thought about this or heard you talk about this? What were some of those challenges?
The second book almost killed me, which is this book, because you're not working from the dissertation anymore. The first book was based on my dissertation. I was working from something. The second book should be something completely new and different from the dissertation, although it may be related. But I don't have a dissertation committee to help me and guide me. And my care duties, I'm an only child. I am still responsible for elder care of two of my parents, both with dementia, and so I have care duties that I'm juggling. I'm teaching full time. I have service obligations, and so it's all the juggling that you don't have when you're completing the first book. If you're lucky enough to be on the tenure track, a lot of departments will protect junior faculty from too much service. After that, man, open season. once you get tenure, they're gonna, I mean, all this, your service obligations go up at the same time in your life cycle that your child care duties and your elder care duties may also be there. And so finding time to get that second book done is a real slog. And it's not you, it's structural. It is much harder. That second book is much harder. I talked about it in a blog post on my blog and wrote and enumerated those challenges and how you can counter them.
For you, how did you then? I mean, yes, absolutely, it is structural. And yet, here you are as an individual having to figure out how to write the second book. How did you keep it a priority for yourself? How did you make it happen?
I think the writing was sort of my way of compartmentalizing and my refuge from the very heavy elder care duties and my other job obligations. This was my time where I could focus on research and writing that was meaningful to me. That is the noble answer. The more realistic answer is sheer pig-headed stubbornness and spite. I had sunk so much time into this project. I said, "Oh no, 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 I'm gonna drag myself to the finish line because I know people are wondering, what is she doing? She keeps talking about this book. Where is this book? Is there even a book?" So through sheer spite, I'm like, no, there's a book. I'm gonna finish it.
Amazing. I want to ask you a funny question, but you are also known on social media for your cooking. You are a spectacular cook. At least you appear to be. I've never been lucky enough to sample your food, but everything I hear is that you're a spectacular cook. I interviewed Gautam Rao recently, and his acknowledgments, he even mentions not only your scholarship, but your cooking. What role does a hobby like that play in relationship to your writing? Or does it?
The cooking is my creative outlet. It is what we do as scholars takes so long, right? To write a dissertation, to write a mere article, to write a book takes years, if not the shortest is months, the longest is years. I need more instant gratification and I need something that's visually beautiful. So the cooking keeps me sane. It's sort of like mindfulness training. I can't doom scroll if I have a sharp knife in my hands and I'm cutting up vegetables. I can't. It makes me focus on the present. And also you've watched The Shining. All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. I would go nuts if all I had was work. I mean, look, I enjoy my work. I love my work, but I cannot just be my job. I am not just my job. I have other things that I like to do.
Think that's a very healthy perspective. I've also been really struck that not only did you have to sort of retrain yourself to think as a historian and learn all this historical background, but becoming interdisciplinary also meant building a whole new community, really, of scholars. And that we often think about writing as sort of the solitary act that we do on our own. And you have been a remarkable presence in sort of the historical community and becoming part of, especially that legal history world. How did you do that? How did you find a new community of historians to connect with?
All of that was done online through social media. So first, beginning with Twitter many years ago, there would be zero US historians and legal historians who knew who I was if I was not on social media. I've met other historians, I've met law professors, I've met sociologists who do historical work, and it's all on social media. And I think people think of social media as a broadcast mechanism where you say things and you make connections that way, but actually it's establishing relationships even if you never met the person, right? It's talking to people you don't usually talk to. It's not just broadcasting your own research, but sharing other people's research and asking them questions about it and engaging with other people. So when you meet them at a conference for the first time in real life, like Kevin Cruz and Adam Rothman that I met this past weekend, and Beverly Gage, I don't know them in real life. I've only talked to Adam and Kevin online, but so it's an icebreaker, and it's much easier where I feel like I knew them. Of course, I don't know them, but it's at least it's like, oh, yeah, I know I've spoken to you before, even if not in person.
I'm curious that, you know, it sounds like you learned a lot from historians in the process of working on this book. What do you think historians could learn from political scientists?
Hmm. Well, the way we think of institutions as structuring and channeling power, I think the way we focus on power and not just I feel like I learned more from historians, and I think I'm not the right person to ask what historians have learned from my book. I mean, I would love to hear it, but I don't really know. I guess I will know once the book gets reviewed and I see. I mean, what's scary is, well, scary for me is because it's an interdisciplinary book, it will get reviewed in history journals, not just political science journals and law journals. It will get reviewed. And I knew that from the beginning. And I knew I was going to be held to standards of history journals. I would like to say one thing that I learned from historians from reading so many monographs. I'm trained as a historical institutionalist, so I study how institutions like the federal courts or federalism evolve and develop over time. I'm not trained to study people. In my first book, it's about the Supreme Court and the US Courts of Appeals. When readers ask me, but what about the people of the cases that they decided? I would say, I don't know. I only read legal opinions. I didn't read the voices or consider the voices of the immigrants whose cases were being decided. So this time, after reading so much history, I didn't want this to be a story of, oh, these poor innocent people and these terrible things being done to them. So I learned from historians you need to take into consideration and get across the agency of the people involved.
Were the peer reviewers for this book, did they come from a historical perspective or political science?
All of it.
Okay.
So what I had two rounds of reviewers at Oxford. The first round, I could tell it was a political scientist who's a American political development expert and a US historian of the 19th century. The final round of review was a US historian of the 19th century and a law professor immigration law professor who said at the first line of the review, I teach US immigration law. I do not know the history that she's covering. This is not ideal, but that was the two readers that I had. Yes.
Wow, interesting. Perhaps that leads well to my next question, which is that I've seen on social media that you've had some thoughts to share recently on what writers maybe should and shouldn't do when it comes to picking a press to publish their book. Would you share the advice that you have for people?
I think that when writers are trying to find a press, they need to talk to someone who published with that press within that year because academic publishing is in flux. There's a lot of presses are restructuring, not in a great way from what I've experienced. And talking to somebody who published with that press 3 years ago is not really going to give you an accurate picture of what's going on. There are some presses that do a lot better at promoting the author's books if that is important to them. And so just by observing and talking to other historians, I know UNC and Princeton, and from talking to my political science friend who published with Princeton, they're amazing with promoting their authors. Other presses, not so much. It there's so many considerations, but you have to talk to authors who published with those presses in that year to see what their experiences are like and talk to more than one person. And that's why it's helpful to be on social media where you can see who published with Oxford, who published with UNC. Can you ask them questions?
You sometimes get those sort of behind the scenes glimpses
Right,
of
right.
process. Absolutely. Why is it important to you to make sure you're promoting your book, not just, get it out there, go for promotion, but why does it matter to you to make sure other people are seeing it?
I would like nothing better after a 16-year project than to drop the book and go back into the woods. I really would love that because I'm truly sick of it, which sounds strange. But I work at CUNY Brooklyn College, a underfunded public school. I'm not in the sort of fancy networks of the R1s or the Ivies. And so my book can be amazing, but who will know about it? And I have some friends who say they write scholarship for themselves to figure out a intellectual question. Okay, yes, all that, but I want someone to read it after 16 years. So if I don't promote it, I know no one will. If I don't toot my own horn, no one will. So it would be the if you don't promote your book, it's like running a marathon, sitting down at mile 24 and say, whew, yeah, that's close enough. Whew, that was hard. Finish the race. Promote the book.
What is the most influential writing advice you've ever gotten?
I think from my friend Ben Karp, who read several substantial, very messy Revolutionary War and colonial chapters. There were many days where I would sit down to write. I had the time blocked out and it just wasn't flowing. And it's so frustrating when that happens. And Ben reminded me, he said, you can't measure your writing progress in one day. Think of what you accomplished over a 2-week period. There will be days where it's really flowing and you can sit there for 3, 4 straight hours and write, what my former grad student, Brendan O'Malley, says, demon write. He's like, you can demon write. But those days are rare. And there will be many other days where I'm sitting at the computer, rewriting, going nowhere with one paragraph. So Ben said, you need to measure your progress in 2-week increments, not in a day. There's no point in beating yourself up for, oh my God, I had 4 hours, I completely wasted it. I got nothing done.
Who do you like to read as inspiration for your writing?
Megan Kate Nelson, an amazing narrative historian, Lucy Salyer, my favorite legal historian. I don't know how to do narrative history. I will probably never learn, but I admire people who write it and who execute it very well.
Are you thinking about another project? Will you do more history in the future?
Well, for the political scientists out there, all three of them, my ambition is to go nowhere near the 20th century with my research again. So it's going to be early republic and 19th century. My third book project that I got the idea for writing the second book is, why does everyone know Ellis Island? And no one's heard of, except some California people, no one knows Angel Island off of San Francisco, and even fewer people know Gadsden's Wharf in Charleston, South Carolina, where 200 boatloads of enslaved people disembarked. What about those other American gateway cities? And what does that say? I would use U.S. immigration history again to theorize about the intersection of historiography and constitutional memory. So that is the tentative plan for the third book.
Interesting. Have you started reading for that?
Started reading and I visited Gadsden's Wharf and Angel Island in the last year to sort of see how those, how the public history, how those sites are presented to the general public.
Well, I look forward to seeing what comes of that. Dr. Anna Law, thanks so much for joining me on Drafting the Past, and congratulations on your new book and welcome to the world of history.
Thank you so much. This was so fun.
That's our show for today. Thanks for listening, and thanks again to Dr. Anna Law for joining me on this episode. You'll find a link to her book and everything else we talked about in this episode in the show notes at draftingthepast.com. If you know a friend who would like this episode, maybe you know a political scientist who's dreaming of being a historian, please pass it on to them. Until next time, remember that friends don't let friends write boring history.